Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well this evening. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, and I am Yves Engler coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And this is about the 70th session of the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, a weekly kind of update and discussion about Canada's role in the world from a critical perspective. And I have an engagement later on this evening, so I have to be out right at 7. So I get right to things. So there's some time for some comments and questions and discussion at the end. Again, hope everyone is doing well this evening. To start off with, the Financial Times had a story titled "Seabed Miner Criticized Over Pacific Slurry Spill." And it was over the Vancouver-based company that's been pushing to extract resources from the bottom of the sea. It's called the Metals Company. And they've been pushing this whole agreement to allow this to happen, and there was an accord a couple of weeks ago. It's called the International Seabed Authority. Anyways, apparently 6 months ago, they spilled 72,000 liters of water with seabed sediment and metallic fragments that they, I guess, when they were sort of prospecting, I don't know if it's called that, you do it below the ocean. And the controversy is the fact that the International Seabed Authority decided that this spill didn't violate their regulations. I obviously know almost nothing about the technical side of this, but there's some environmental group quoted in the Financial Times story saying this is a very bad kind of omen about this Seabed Authority. If they basically buried this as unimportant in terms of how they will go forward. But this is just one example. Canadian, as I've mentioned previously, Canadian companies are leading the push to extract resources from the bottom of the sea. They're leading the efforts to try to extract resources from space, and of course, they are leading the struggle or the push in many far corners of the planet that we inhabit. The Canadian press published a story, which one outlet headlined, "Liberals haven't answered 2020 invite for Canada to join global body creating vaccines for poor countries." And according to some documents they got from the government, that South Korea has been pushing Canada to join this initiative, and the Trudeau government is just basically stalling. And this is about actually, rather than sort of potentially giving vaccines, which happened during the pandemic, to other countries in the global South, this is about, I guess, a process of trying to help them actually manufacture their own vaccines. And that, I guess, is the pharmaceutical companies, the big pharma is not, they're less excited about that. They're okay with Canada buying their product and giving it somewhere, less interested in actually helping other places build potential, I guess, or manufacture potential competitors. The Globe and Mail on Saturday had this full-page story titled "Camp Masad Memories." And it was from this author who talked about the summer camp he went to somewhere outside of Winnipeg as a youth, and that now his kids and I think grandkids also have gone to or are going to. And there's a number of elements of this article that were fascinating. First of all, it was very clear, mentioned multiple times, that this was a Zionist summer camp, and that they pushed a pro-Israel kind of Jewish identity is Israel kind of angle, and there was no sort of like nothing critical about it. So, on one hand, I think to myself, if you're a Palestinian reading this long, 5,000-6,000 word story, it's sort of all about like it's actually quite a bizarre article, because it's kind of about like growing up and these camps as a place for like young teenagers to have like meet the other sex and sort of sexual kind of liberation away from parents, and you're sleeping not very far from the opposite sex or whatever, go into all this kind of stuff, and some just sort of like reminiscing of like fond summer memories. But then it's all kind of like wrapped in with this Zionist politic, but there's nothing critical about the Zionist politic. And I'm just thinking to myself, if you're a Palestinian who's been like driven from their home, by Zionism, how would you sort of relate to this kind of like glorifying story of this summer camp and coming to age as a teenager and a youth and this and that, with this whole Zionist thing? The other part I find interesting, and it's considered very taboo to sort of like mention this, is that it's sort of justified at some point. I guess the camp started in like the 1930s. And so it's justified as at some point in the article by saying, well, at that time, Jews were excluded from, lots of different domains, and sort of like kind of like we needed to set up our own camps, is kind of how it's sort of presented. But what's left out of that is that here we are 8 or 9 decades later, and certainly 5-6 decades since any sort of formalized legalistic anti-Semitism, and the camp's still going on. And so it's sort of like, if you're gonna justify the camp from that lens, how do you then bring that up to today? And that's of course not dealt with in this sort of glorification of Zionist summer camps, which apparently there are quite a few of in the country, in Canada and the US. It's not a topic that I've actually really delved into, and I think it is one that deserves some attention. I have looked into the whole question of schools and how Jewish schools, private schools, are basically Zionist training grounds, and there's all kinds of very outrageous stuff that goes on there. But the summer camp question is something that needs to be certainly challenged and looked into. In the Globe, David Matas, who's the senior counsel for B'nai B'rith, and I think it's Ariel Braun, who's a University of Toronto prof, they published this op-ed titled "Israelis Can Sort Out Their Legal Reform Issues on Their Own." And I think it's an indirect response to Andrew Cohen's piece in the Ottawa Citizen about 10 days ago, which basically said that there's been some dissent among the mainstream anti-Palestinian Jewish organizations over the judicial reforms in Israel, and sort of like siding with the protesters to some extent. That some of these major anti-Palestinian groups in the US have come out publicly and sort of criticized that. And what Cohen is saying is that hasn't happened in Canada. And he points out, I think I mentioned this last week, he points out that CIJA, Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs director in Israel, is actually on the public record, wrote an op-ed celebrating these judicial reforms back at the start of the year. And so I think this piece in the Globe is kind of a response to Cohen's criticism of CIJA and B'nai B'rith, and indirectly Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, who have stayed quiet on what's happening in Israel. And but their piece is just like, it's just kind of like unbelievable. Their basic argument is that we can criticize enemy states, but we shouldn't criticize democracies. Well, they use the word authoritarian states. Now, they're in a bit of a bind here because David Matas, well, both of them are on the record like repeatedly criticizing all kinds of other countries, usually official enemies, right? So what they're basically saying is it's okay for Canadians to criticize official enemies where we basically have, very limited influence, but we shouldn't be criticizing Israel because they frame it as it's democracy. And so they really have the world like flipped upside down. And to make this argument when these two people are part of organizations that raise hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every year for projects in Israel, and then you don't even have the right, let alone they celebrate everything that Israel does to Palestinians, all the horrors they do to Palestinians. They're arguing that you don't even have the right to criticize when the colonialist supremacist state starts turning, its fascistic tendencies on Jewish Israelis. They're saying that Canadians have to, we can fund it, we can, provide all these different forms of support for it. We can't even, make any kind of mild criticism of the turning of this colonialist supremacist policies against the Jewish Israeli population. It's pretty remarkable, and it's remarkable, quite frankly. It appears in the Globe and Mail, but that's where we are at in this country politically. The NDP, Jagmeet Singh, came out a few days ago, basically saying that the other parties are not willing to expand the foreign interference discussion to include other countries. And he cites Russia, Iran, and India. And there's a story that from some Iranian media outlet that I saw that was titled, "Canadian Party Seeks Probe on Election Interference by Iran." And it's from obviously a sort of anti-government outlet, anti-Iranian government outlet. And it got me thinking, it's like, well, first of all, the idea that Iran would have even comparable influence in Canadian politics to Israel is so outlandish. It's beyond discussing. But it basically what's acceptable in the official mainstream politics in Canada around the foreign interference question is to lessen this focus on China, which I think is a good thing. I think it's a good thing. I think if the option is just China or some other official enemies, India is not, of course, an official enemy. India is a bit more complicated. It's obviously better to expand it because it softens this idea that China is running Canada and China this, that, whatever, right? So I think what the NDP is doing is actually going in a right direction, but it speaks to the parameters of official discussion when the acceptable criticism is to expand it to other sort of official enemies and other sort of targeted states of the Canadian government. It's I think very revealing of how boxed in geopolitical discussion is in this country. Front page of the Globe, Tuesday, Wednesday, I forget what day it was an article titled "Dissidents Decry Hong Kong Police Presence at Sports Event." So there's some sort of big police and I guess firefighter, maybe an ambulance or whatever they call it, or first responders, games taking place in Winnipeg, and apparently there's some Hong Kong police that are part of this, and apparently they've actually done well. They've won some awards. I don't know if they in Winnipeg or in previous ones. Anyway, they're I guess fairly good at this, and so there's this criticism of this, and the Globe puts on the front page, and then yesterday or 2 days ago they have a follow-up story, another big significant story, where it says Global Affairs Canada says it wasn't consulted about the Hong Kong police participating. And in this story, they quote this dissident Hong Kong organization in Canada that's just, one of these probably American government funded groups that's, China, target China, whatever. And and they basically they quote them saying that like these Hong Kong police being in Canada is a threat to Hong Kongers who have come to Canada for safety, to seek safety. And I'm like, are you? This is just so divorced from reality. Okay, they're here for some sports game in Winnipeg. There's not many Hong Kongers in Winnipeg. I think most of the Hong Kong community would be in Vancouver primarily, Toronto secondary. Okay. And then when you start getting into this and the Hong Kong police thing, the reality is during those protests, 2018, 2019, they didn't kill anyone. Okay, the Hong Kong police didn't kill anyone. The protesters killed a 70-year-old. They lit a 57-year-old on fire, and they injured dozens and dozens of police. The police did injure some protesters. Okay. In 2012, during the Quebec student strike, the Montreal police and the Sûreté de Québec, I think at least 3 people had their eyes shot out, lost eyesight, at least in one eye, by the Montreal police or the Quebec City police or the Quebec provincial police. No, as far as I know, no police officer was substantively injured. I'm sure some were like, maybe a broken hand at max. There was no, as far as I know, there was no, people should maybe check that, but no substantial injury by any Quebec police officer during that. So the violence was overwhelmingly one directional during 2012 student strike in Quebec. Now, so I don't have any doubt. I don't have any doubt that the Hong Kong police, as police basically everywhere, are repressive. But this idea that the Hong Kong police coming in and participating in some games in Winnipeg would threaten people who left Hong Kong is so beyond the pale of ridiculousness. But this is what appears in the Globe and Mail in our serious media. So the Globe on Saturday had a story about Canada participating in this Ukraine conference in Saudi Arabia, and this sort of peace initiative kind of thing. In principle and sort of an abstract level, I think it's a good thing. I think any forum to talk about some sort of peace negotiations, proposal, truce, stuff like that is a good thing. Russia wasn't part of it. That's a big problem, of course. The Canadian position was just to repeat the same thing. Russia has to get out of all of the Donbass, Crimea, just the completely unhelpful nonsense. So this is, I think it's something to be, it appears from one report I saw, doesn't seem like much has come out of this peace conference. But the Canadian government is sort of continuing with the same kind of thinking on all of this, while they at least attended. I think actually attending is probably a good thing. There was probably some hesitation attending around it being in Saudi Arabia. The Ukrainian government's trying to use this frame this as like countries of the South that are now aligning with it, which had previously not necessarily aligned with it diplomatically. I think that's an exaggeration. But nevertheless, the Financial Times had a very depressing story from the Ukrainian perspective about 5 or 6 days ago, titled "Ukraine's EU road is littered with obstacles," and the author is arguing that it's even less likely that Ukraine is going to be able to join the EU than NATO. Okay, so now we just see, I think, is increasingly clear with what happened in the NATO summit that Ukraine's just going to be left after all of this, of course. The country's going to be destroyed. Russia's going to have a chunk of the country. NATO's not going to be willing to take it in because Russia has a chunk of it. The EU's not going to be willing to take it in because for a whole series of different factors. It's going to just be a huge sort of charity case on the EU for years, decades, for a whole bunch of reasons, because its economy is already or even before the invasion, was so much weaker than most of the rest of the EU economies, and it's even gotten even weaker since because of its massive agricultural sector, because the other Eastern European countries that get big chunks of the EU transfers right now aren't going to want to lose the EU transfers they're currently getting. And so all these things that were kind of like thrown out to the Ukrainians, the offer of NATO, joining NATO, joining the EU, this is a big part. Let's remember, these sort of inducements is a big part of what galvanized the sort of like, Western Ukrainian focused, often tied in with nationalists, but not necessarily the hardline nationalist types to support all this, right? Is that they sort of say, oh, well, we're going to get to join the EU. We're going to be way wealthier than Russia. It's all, this is the promised land. And it's looking increasingly like you're not going to get any of the you're going to get all the destruction. You're not going to get any of the promised land. That's very, it just, I guess it is what it is. The Canadian government, one story I saw just talked about it's actually training Ukrainian forces in 5 different places in UK, Poland, and Latvia. And the Financial Times on Saturday had this big long story about sort of hacking this conference going back to like 2002, I believe it was, that happened in Odessa, where like Russian and Ukrainian and some other, mostly Russian, Ukrainian, I think maybe Belarusian as well, kind of hackers got together and kind of basically planned out in the context of very, weak kind of legal structures and lots of sort of like post-communist, criminal organizations and stuff like that in Russia and Ukraine, and were sort of planning their sort of different financial scams. And it is kind of an interesting story, kind of not that politically relevant to Canada, but in the story, they point out that the Ukrainian security forces have this like they're really capable of dealing with hacking and cyber attacks and stuff like that. And they say the reason why is because they've had some experience dealing with Russian cyber attacks, and they note because their intelligence are, quote, supported by the intelligence services of the US, Britain, and Canada. And this is something we knew, but we hear about what's in the public domain, right? About Canada training, Operation Unifier and stuff like that. But alongside that is a whole other domain of Canada's involvement and US and British involvement that we don't hear much about. And the intelligence element is one that is, I think, a really important one we don't hear that much about. And apparently, according to this story, Canada's been heavily involved in helping the Ukrainians in dealing with cyber attacks, and presumably, of course, helping them also launch cyber attacks. So yesterday was the 78th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, and day after tomorrow is the 78th anniversary of bombing of Nagasaki, where the Americans killed, I'm not sure exact number, 200,000 or something like that, people, because they wanted to send a message to the Soviets that they had nukes and they were prepared to use them. So I thought I would talk a little bit about Canada's role in nuclear weapons, and the initial development, the agreement between the UK and the US in terms of merging their nuclear weapons programs took place in Quebec City in August 1943. It's called the Quebec Agreement, and it was part of the World War II Combined Policy Committee that was sort of organizing war affairs. And the Canadian representative I'm totally blanking on his name, prominent, he was the industry minister at the time. He was there later on when the Americans brought their proposal of dropping the bombs on Japan, and we don't know what he said. C.D. Howe, the second in charge of the government after the prime minister, and we don't know what he said, but presumably he okayed. He didn't object to the U.S. plan. There was, of course, Canadian uranium, lots of Canadian scientists, McGill and other places that were involved in the development program, and then there's that infamous comment that Mackenzie King, the prime minister, wrote in his diary, his uncensored diary, that, quote, it is fortunate that the use of the bomb should have been upon the Japanese rather than upon the white races of Europe. So he was quite racist in his outlook on that. So Canada was a contributor, a substantive contributor to nuclear, the initial dropping of nuclear weapons, and were, supportive of that. And Canada has been, on board with nuclear weapons, decades onwards. There's some rhetorical claim to disarmament, but we go back in 54, Canada voted to allow NATO forces to accept tactical nuclear weapons. We have Canadian jets based in Europe for a couple of decades that have U.S. nuclear bombs. You have U.S. Bomarks based in Canada, all kinds of different types of U.S. nuclear weapons in Canada. And Canada, of course, is part of NATO, participates in NATO's nuclear planning group, supports NATO's nuclear policy directorate, opposed resolution calling on removal of nukes from high alert status because it's incompatible with NATO policy. When 2/3 of the world got together in 2017 for the conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination, Canada boycotted that, opposed it. That they, of course, came up with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Canada has voted against all the UN resolutions. Usually 120 countries or so back those resolutions supporting the TPNW. And all the while with the Trudeau government, it's just remarkable. They simultaneously will say they believe that nuclear weapons should be eliminated, but they basically oppose everything that's trying to do that. It's pretty remarkable how they get away with that, the double standard, but they do, and the media rarely challenges them on that. The front page of the Globe about, I think on Tuesday or Wednesday, had a story about reproductive care, access to reproductive abortion, and I guess the morning after pill and other things in Honduras. And it was titled, "Honduran Women Risk Death and Imprisonment as They Try to Access Reproductive Care." And this big, long story, it's a real kind of remarkable coming together of Canadian foreign policy propaganda. So first of all, the story is written by this person who says, at the end of the story, says, "The trip to Honduras was partly funded by Bigger Than Our Borders, an NGO-supported initiative urging the Canadian government to increase foreign aid programs." So it's basically some NGO that gets most of its government, most of its money from the government, that its main initiative is to push the government to increase Canadian aid, which of course that NGO and any NGOs that are associated with it will get a chunk of that increased Canadian aid, right? So a big chunk of, and this goes back to the founding of CEDA in 1968, the Canadian International Development Agency, is that they wanted NGOs to be a lobby group for increased aid, right? They wanted to basically justify their bureaucratic. So the NGOs were designed from the CEDA's perspective, in part, to go out publicly and call for more Canadian aid which was because they were well perceived among the public, much better than if CETA itself was calling for increased aid. Okay, so that's the first thing. And in the story, they talk about Canada's feminist international assistance program, and they frame this positively. The real outrage in this story, to me, is this passage. It says, quote, in 2009, then President Manuel Zelaya was ousted in a coup by Honduras's army with the support of powerful political elites. Religious leaders took on prominent positions in politics and condemned emergency contraception, also known as the morning after pill. So this story is linking this real deterioration in women's access to reproductive care to the 2009 coup. But the 2009 coup has nothing to do with Canada, according to this story. Okay, for a Canadian audience, by a Canadian NGO, in a Canadian publication. Now, of course, the Canadian government backed the 2009 coup in Honduras, right? And not just like passively. It wasn't like Aristide in 2004 or Yanukovych in 2014 in Ukraine, but it was far beyond just a sort of saying, hey, we accept this and we continue on as normal. You had Canadian officials justifying what the coup government was doing. You have engagement in destabilizing Zelaya and demonizing him for his referendum that he was holding. You have the World Bank and even Americans ostensibly saying they were going to cut off aid. Canada never even announced any cutting off of aid. You had the continuation of Canadian military trainers. So Canada was, and then when the dubious elections happened later on, they legitimate that process. Canada was an active, not massive, but an active participant in this coup, and that's just completely ignored in this Globe and Mail story. And this is sophisticated propaganda, right? There's no lie, no lie took place, but it's an omission that is, completely it fuels this notion of Canada being, we have our feminist international assistance program that's trying to help those Honduran women get access to reproductive care, yet we helped oust a government that led to a worsening on that front. That's not important, but us helping out, and it goes to creating this mythology of Canada's role in the world. So another part of this Globe and Mail propaganda that I thought I would talk about is in a story where Jeffrey York and another person, Jeffrey York's the Globe and Mail correspondent in South Africa, who, in terms of a Globe and Mail correspondent, he's the better end. He is at the best end of any foreign correspondent, really. There's not many of them left, but he does do some reporting that's some pretty good reporting. But in this story about what's happened, Canada's role in Niger, there's a passage that's just unbelievable. So it's about Canada's military training, which is substantive military training of the Nigerian military over the past decade. This article says, quote, "This has left the country in the hands of military leaders who seem to have abandoned the democratic gospel the Canadians were preaching." Canada was preaching the democratic gospel to the Nigerian military as part of their training program. And this is like so divorced from anything to do with Canadian policy anywhere, let alone in Africa. So as we just mentioned, the Honduras coup of 2009, you have during Trudeau's government, you have Pedro Castillo back in December, you have Evo Morales in 2019. Fine with those coups. There's about two dozen examples of Canada actively or passively supporting the ouster of elected governments over the past 60 or 70 years. Just take a look at Canada's policy on the African continent. As Jeffrey York at the Globe knows very well, our main ally is Paul Kagame, who's been a dictator of Rwanda for 3 decades. Look at what we do with our foreign investment promotion protection agreements to try to basically insulate Canadian mining companies from the democratic process. That's a big part. The Trudeau government's continued that. The Harper government was doing that. Previous government was signing those accords, continued that. You go back, you look at the structural adjustment programs that we were pushing in the late 1980s through the 90s while there were IMF riots, people, mass uprisings, and we were pushing huge amounts of Canadian aid money directly and indirectly through the World Bank and IMF. We're supporting that. You go back and look at Canada's role in the colonial period in Africa, backing colonial rule. There was Canadians who were colonial governors of 3 different, northern Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana. Canadians who were British colonial governors there. You had a whole program from McGill, University of Toronto, Queen's University, of taking recent graduates to be administrators in the British colonial service in Africa primarily, but elsewhere as well. What was termed as taking them into the white man's burden. That's how it was actually marketed back in the 1920s. And that went on for a couple of decades. Canada totally supported the colonial, the NATO Mutual Assistance Program weapon we were giving to the French while they were massacring people in Algeria, to the Belgians while they were killing people in Congo, the Brits while they were suppressing the Mau Mau revolt in Kenya. The Canadians had helped conquer the continent. Hundreds of Canadians fought colonizing the continent, mostly on behalf of Britain, a little bit also on behalf of the Belgian king in the Congo. All kinds of massacres. I detail a lot of this in my Canada and Africa book. There is no history of Canada supporting democracy in Africa, right? There is no history. It doesn't exist. There's no evidence that this has been some, the gospel Canada's preaching to the militaries that it's training. It's farcical, right? But this is what appears in our most sophisticated newspaper from Jeffrey York, who's our best end of the foreign policy, foreign correspondence. So this is part of how the propaganda system works and how we see the Globe Mail continuing these kind of things. Now, to our final subject that I thought I would delve into, which is what's going on in Niger. And basically what we know is that a president that was elected, there's question marks around that election and how reflective of the will it was. But there was at least nominal elections. He was ousted by the Presidential Guard. He, of course, is pro-US, pro-French. He's called for a foreign military intervention. The military rulers have called for French troops to leave the country. They've called to abrogate some of the post-colonial accords that Paris imposed on the country. We have the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, making some pretty aggressive moves. I would say on a personal level, military coups are usually a bad thing. Foreign military interventions are an even worse thing, and ECOWAS is threatening an intervention. Their deadline has now passed, saying that they would intervene with it if the constitutional order was not reinstated. So we'll see where that goes with the intervention. Now, what I thought was important to some context that I haven't seen mentioned, a couple of pieces of context I haven't seen mentioned anywhere. One is, so ECOWAS and their West African standby force. I don't know much about it, but during my Canada and Africa book, I wrote about, I researched, I spent a decent, 1,000 words, 1,500 words, a few pages, 5-6 pages on Canada's role in basically creating this African security infrastructure. This goes back to like the 2005 kind of range. These standby forces, regional standby forces, and basically what this is, and I quote the head of AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command, and they basically say we want these forces to do. We want to work through local forces. They frame it, the American military frames it as, security and dealing with terror and problems, whatever. And I think the anti-imperialist framing is to, dominate the continent. And so back to that point, Canada has been funding and supporting ECOWAS, a standby force, and the other regional African Union associated regional forces. And that the most aggressive things we've seen, of course, are with Somalia and the occupation of Somalia, and that goes back to the American-backed Egyptian or Ethiopian invasion, where the Americans were literally providing the gasoline for the trucks to invade. But we've that mission has continued on 15 years later, and so Canada's been heavily involved in that, and in ECOWAS. So if ECOWAS invades, there's no doubt that that's Washington, Paris, and Ottawa. That's in the background, and Canada spent tens of millions of dollars building up these regional security infrastructure to do this kind of thing. When a government that is ousted, that they didn't want to have ousted, that they don't want, Canada, the U.S., France don't want to send their troops to reverse that. They want regional force to do that. And so that's a context that I haven't seen any discussion of at all. I haven't even seen discussion of that from an American perspective, let alone from the Canadian element, and how much AFRICOM has put into ECOWAS standby force. But the other part, and this was in the Globe piece, is that so there's been about 50 Canadians training the Nigerian force over the past decade as part of Operation Naberius. There's Canadian Special Forces alongside that through Operation or Exercise Flintlock, which is a U.S.-led training program. They've been training the special forces in Niger and other Sahel region countries for about a decade now, a little bit over a decade. And Canada's been part of that. Canada, France, and Britain, the US are the players there. So that's some context. And now the other context that's really important in all this is the 2011 Libya, and how the NATO destruction of Libya fueled the jihadist violence in the Sahel region. And this was all like totally understood at the time, right? The Canadian military understood beforehand, before the invasion, that this was likely to lead to growth of jihadist violence and instability in Libya and the region. And the Canadian Special Force, or the Canadian Air Force at the time, they joked that they were Al-Qaeda's Air Force while they were bombing Libya in 2011. That was reported on by Puglisi in the Ottawa Citizen. Simultaneously, the African Union pushed hard for negotiations early on, before NATO starts bombing the war in Libya, and the NATO countries completely ignored that. And now, part of what's really important about that is the whole justification for the training of the African standby forces and stuff like that, is that they frame it as African solutions to African problems. So we want Africans to deal with their own security problems. Now, when the African Union was trying to negotiate an end to the conflict in Libya that ultimately leads to this huge bombing campaign, they completely ignore the African Union. And now the African Union's position, quoted at the time very clearly about it's going to lead to a rise of terrorism and weapons are going to flow around. And they said everything that happened, they said it beforehand. They just totally ignored the African Union dealing with an African solution to African problem at that time. And so here we are 12 years later. Everyone agrees. I think everyone, from what I can tell in Nigerian politics, from the ousted president to the current rulers, that what happened in Libya has led to this violence in Niger, jihadist violence, and that part of the political tension in the country is tied to this violence that's been was worsened by what happened, what NATO did in Libya, and then so of course then the American, there's about 1,100 American troops, about 1,500 French troops, some other NATO country troops, including of course the Canadian training mission. This is all then justified. Our military role in Niger is justified by this jihadist violence that our policies in Libya partly, exacerbated, right? So that's some context that I think is important. And finally, because we are close to the end here, close to 7 o'clock, just a little bit about the economic question. And Canada doesn't seem to have huge mining interests in Niger. There are mining interests. There are bigger mining interests in regional Mali and Burkina Faso. The first industrial mine in Niger Goes back to 2000 from Montreal company Semafo. And there's this 2007 Montreal Gazette business article that I've quoted in a few places, written about it in a few places, that's quite remarkable about this mine. And it's titled Local Miner, a Major Force in Niger. It's not every day we receive a press release from a gold mining company that includes a warm personal message from the Prime Minister. So the story reports on the close ties between Semafo and the then Prime Minister, quoting Benoit Lassalle, the head of Semafo, saying, "We work very closely with him. We're part of his budget every year." And then he goes on. This is the head of the mining company. Goes on. Who, just on his side, he begins his operations in West Africa through his role at Plan Canada, a big NGO. And I've written about this elsewhere. I'm not going to get into it, but basically he was this big NGO person, and he gets tied in with the government in Burkina Faso through the NGO, and then decides that there's all these opportunities for mining profits to be made. So this is the guy who frames himself as this, like, I care about Africa, NGO worker type, whatever. Anyway, so the head of the mining company, talking to the Montreal Gazette 2007, goes on to say, talking about how the Prime Minister helped them break a strike. Okay, he said, he gave us all the right direction to solve this legally. We went to court, we had the strike declared illegal, and that allowed us to let go of some of the employees and rehire some of them based upon a new work contract. It allowed us to let go of some undesirable employees because they had been on strike a few times, right? So he's just like openly boasting that, like, we just basically, wiped out, we destroyed the union. We fired people because they've been on strike too many times. Now, of course, when you delve into what they paid the employees and the working conditions, they're absolutely abominable. This is just like horrendous work conditions, horrendous ecological damage. And there was a government committee that looked into, basically the government was supposed to have a 20% stake in the mine, did not receive any benefits, even though they took out 350,000 ounces of gold from Niger, worth about $350 million by 2010. Nothing went to the government. And of course, this is one of the poorest, most impoverished countries in the world. So they're sucking out all this gold, and I think 40% of the country's malnourished and stuff like that. So there are Canadian economic interests in the country. And I think I'll just leave it at that. And if people have questions or comments, I see that Laura is back. So I'll unmute her, and if I don't see people hands, if Laura, if you can help out with the moderation, that's okay. Much appreciated.
We have MN. I don't know what that stands for. Has his hand. Oh, MN, let me unmute you.
I think I just did it.
Okay. MN, you're muted still. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, good.
Can I be heard?
Yes, go ahead.
Fantastic. MN is the name for now. So, with all that being said, thank you so very much, Eve, just for the presentation. I'm not going to be too long. I just have a quick question with regards to, this was a recent article that was under Democracy Now!, and it pretty much is entitled, Blowback in Africa, U.S. trained officer overthrows pro-U.S. leader in Niger, site of U.S. drone base. This was published August 4th. My question is, in terms of the geopolitics of what's happening in Niger at this point in time, what is going on in terms of who are the actual military forces in Niger that have overthrown a pro-U.S. leader, but they're trained by the Americans? So I'm trying to kind of understand that piece, because it's almost like you're trained by the Americans, you're overthrowing a U.S. puppet, but then whose interests are you serving? So I kind of want to gauge that piece, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's the central question, and that's the question I'm trying to figure out too. And
right,
and why I didn't really delve into the subject last week because I've seen that, and the Nick Turse, who was one of the people in that Democracy Now! Thing, I've been reading his stuff for like 15 years. Since before doing the Canada and Africa book, about, because he has done really good reporting on AFRICOM and how the American military's presence, they claim they don't have any presence, and then they have these small base, and the one in Niger is not a small base, is actually quite significant. Yes. Now, so all of that, the I don't know would be the simple answer. The Wall Street Journal had a front page piece on Saturday that basically delved into their framing of the dynamics within the coup, which is that and I think this is the first piece of this is I've seen this reported elsewhere, and I think is true. It was the presidential guard that ousted him, or that actually didn't oust him. They locked him down. I believe he still is locked down in his bunker, in his bunker, in the, I guess, the presidential palace or whatever. So he had, according to the Wall Street Journal article, he had the move to remove the head of the presidential guard, and he had, I've seen this reported elsewhere as well, he had lessened some of the benefits that the presidential guard had previously received. And there apparently, I'm not sure if this was in the Wall Street Journal story, I think it was, and I think I saw it elsewhere, it was basically saying that there was tensions within the military, or specifically within the presidential guard and the special forces, who are the ones being trained by the Americans primarily, and that they're basically, what's happening is that the special forces are getting more, they're sort of becoming more and more of the better treated element of the military, and the presidential guard is sort of seeing its position kind of go in the wrong, from their perspective, in the wrong direction, and that part of this coup was that, right, which is that they sort of reject that. And the Wall Street Journal story says that a big part of the Wall Street Journal story is about how the American diplomatic apparatus in the country is like, the ambassador is not in place, the person who's in charge of Niger at the desk at State Department is like in transition, and basically there's a lot of fumbles of American diplomacy that allowed this to happen, that in large part, this is really just a sort of internal military jockeying within the country, but that now it's taken on some broader geopolitical dimension with obviously with Russia, but also with regards to the presidential guard, framing what they're doing as anti-French and sort of anti-imperialist. And so they've clearly made lots of anti-imperialist pronouncements. They made a few. I don't know how concrete the measures actually are. I think they are somewhat concrete in terms of the post, like basically the whole agreements that made the former French colonies pay France for being colonized by France.
Yes, France Afrique.
Yeah, so they've at least ostensibly kind of abrogated some of these. Of course, I don't know what that means exactly legally. I think we have to be careful in most of Africa. It's pretty acceptable political discourse to say that the French and the British and the colonial powers are rotten, nasty, and they should get out. That's not like a left-wing position. That's a pretty widely held position. So it can be pretty cheap politics to say something that sounds quite good in Canadian or US or French kind of political world. It sounds very left-wing, whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's and obviously framing a internal military dispute as we want the presidential guard, we want better pay and better standing within the military versus the special forces. Obviously, that's not exactly very good marketing. So you frame it as we are against the French military presence, and so I like I said at the start, I'm there have been some good military coups in history, right? There have been some left-wing military coups. Not usually, though. Usually military coups are bad things. I would not come close to having any confidence in a pronouncement of where the politics of all this are going. I think that ECOWAS intervention, I think we should be very, very, at minimum cautious and probably straight out oppose that, and certainly any Canadian role in pushing that. And the Canadian government has explicitly said they support ECOWAS's position, which was the one week ultimatum. So So I think we want to be really, kind of pretty bold on that front. I'm personally very cautious about making any sort of declaration that this is like some big anti-imperialist, step forward and this kind of that, because I think that maybe it will play out that way, but I don't. Generally, militaries are not the domains that we want to be relying upon. So that's mine.
Okay, so Eve, Laurel has her hand up. Can you unmute her? I can no longer unmute people. Laurel, can you unmute yourself?
Oh, I think I have to make you Yeah, I'll try to make you co-host. Yeah, go ahead, Laura. I did the.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, this is related to what you're just saying. I mean, it does sound like a horrible situation with Canada and the United States, too much involved in what's going on in Niger. But one of the things that we have to think about now is that we've got Russia and China in the world who are standing up too. And as I read a story the other day about how the rebels in Niger have asked for help from the Wagner group, from the Russian Wagner group, and of course that raises the possibility that the thing that's going on in Ukraine and Russia could also go on in other places too. It could be another proxy war in Niger too, if Russia becomes involved. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And the other thing I was going to say is Global Affairs Canada sounds awful. It's the propaganda arm for the Liberal Party. And boy, do we ever need to do some work on that. It really doesn't sound like the right thing to be having at all. And they're turning everything into what they want it to be in terms of all kinds of places, which is again the thing. You were talking about how the Africans are in Niger are rejecting democratic wisdom. That's part of the war in Ukraine too, democracy versus autocracy. So that they're transferring that battle to Africa too. Anyway, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it seems like there is some popular support for this military ouster. That seems obviously you're in charge and you can get mobilized people, but there was a big rally at a football stadium, like 30,000-40,000 people or something. I think there is some support. There seems to be some level of popular support. It's always unclear of like where that level is, and even if you did have a 50% plus one of the population supporting the military intervening, does that still make it legitimate? Or a dubious president, someone who has dubious electoral legitimacy, still has more electoral legitimacy than a presidential guard. So some of the things like that. Now, I think that the geopolitics, I don't believe that Russia was like consequential in all this. And I think that like the idea that you have this sort of the countries that have like thousands of troops stationed there that have been the colonial authority for a century, and hyping up like Russian influence, that's always like really hilarious, right? Does that not mean that the military rulers could not see Russia as providing them some protection or some strength in combating French and U.S. Influence? I think that they may well see that. I think the idea of like Wagner fighters coming there and expanding proxy wars, that's horrible. That's more death and destruction, and it's likely just to sort of lead to further impoverishment and all this kind of stuff. But yeah,
not to be taken too seriously. In other words,
well, I think it's possible. I think it's definitely possible. I mean, there's Wagner forces in Mali next door, and clearly some degree of alignment between the new rulers in Niger and the Burkina Faso and Mali. So how much of it's rhetorical, how much of it's like real, and I don't really know. But no, there is a geopolitics playing out here. That's now the whole what's happening in Ukraine is influencing some of this, and it's getting tied in with some of this. I don't like. I mean, I think French troops should be out and American troops should be out, and we should be really hammering hard on Canada's role in being a total, absolute hypocrite around democracy and this and that. Oh, so we're condemning this coup, but we had no problem the coup in Peru and Bolivia, and we say we're about democracy in Africa, but we are forcing these accords to protect our mining companies against oversight by democratic governments. So I think we should be pushing hard on that. Getting too far down the path of the aligning with that geopolitical bloc, that's the Russian, Chinese, if you want to call it that, sort of counter to the U.S. NATO bloc. I don't see that as first of all, let people in Niger figure that stuff out themselves, and secondly, I don't think that that's really it's not going to lead to that much good, most likely. But I actually maybe one quick question if there's any more. Otherwise, I actually probably should end because I have something to do.
No, there's no more questions, Yves.
So thanks everyone. Same place, same time next week. Have a good evening. Take care.
Thanks.